Jane Cooper was an ordinary woman with an ordinary life. She worked at a local bookstore, enjoyed quiet evenings with a good book, and took long walks in the park. She had friends, but her life was simple and uneventful. That all changed on a rainy Tuesday evening. Jane was heading home after work when she decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alley she had never noticed before. It was dark, and the rain made the cobblestones slippery, but she felt an inexplicable urge to go that way. Halfway through the alley, she slipped and fell, hitting her head on the ground. Everything went black. When Jane woke up, she found herself in a place that looked like her neighborhood, but something was off. The colors seemed duller, the sounds muted. She shook off the disorientation and started walking home, thinking she might have just been dazed from the fall. But when she reached her house, she found it abandoned and in disrepair. The windows were broken, the paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. She tried the door, but it was locked. Panicking, she ran to her neighbor's house, but it too was empty. As she walked down the street, she realized that the entire neighborhood was deserted. There were no cars, no people, not even animals. She felt a chill run down her spine as she tried to understand what was happening. She decided to head back to the bookstore, hoping to find someone there. When she reached the bookstore, it was just as empty and abandoned as her house. The shelves were bare, and dust covered everything. As she walked through the aisles, she felt a growing sense of dread. Suddenly, she heard a noise from the back room. She cautiously approached the door and pushed it open. Inside, she found a strange, glowing portal. The light was mesmerizing, and she felt an irresistible urge to step through it. As soon as she did, she felt a sharp pain and everything went black again. Jane woke up with a start, back in the alley where she had fallen. She sighed in relief, thinking it had all been a bad dream. But when she stood up, she realized she was not in her world. The sky was a strange purplish hue, and the buildings around her were twisted and distorted. She started walking, hoping to find someone who could help her. As she turned a corner, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the distance. She called out to it, but it did not respond. She walked closer, and the figure suddenly turned and ran. Jane chased after it, desperate for answers. The figure led her to a large, old mansion at the edge of town. She hesitated for a moment before entering. The inside was dark and cold, and the air felt heavy. She wandered through the halls, calling out for help, but there was no response. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see the shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall, holding a knife. Jane screamed and started to run, but the figure was fast. It caught up to her and plunged the knife into her chest. She felt a searing pain as she fell to the ground and everything went black. Jane woke up with a gasp, back in the alley. She felt her chest, but there was no wound. It was as if nothing had happened, but she knew it had. She was trapped in some kind of nightmare world where she was doomed to die horribly, over and over again. She tried to escape the town, but every time she reached the outskirts, she would find herself back in the alley. She tried to avoid the shadowy figure, but it always found her, always killed her in some gruesome way. Sometimes it was a knife, sometimes a rope, sometimes fire or water. Each death was more painful than the last. Jane lost track of time. Days, weeks, maybe even months passed, but she could not escape. She tried to fight back, but the figure was always too strong. She tried to hide, but it always found her. She even tried to end her own life, but she would always wake up in the alley unharmed. One day, Jane met another person in the nightmare world. His name was Tom, and he had been trapped there for years.